Ik open deze plechtigheid met gebed en ik zou willen vragen daartoe dat de hoogleraren, de mannelijke, hun beret afnemen. Mogen de geest van wijsheid en barmhartigheid in ons allen groeien en tot volle wasdom komen. Gaat u zitten, dames en heren. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to all of you. We are gathered here to listen to the inaugural speech of Professor Morag Goodwin, who holds the chair of Global Law and Development at our Tilburg Law School. Professor Goodwin works in the emerging field of global law and addresses the impact of globalization on the discipline and practice of law. More specifically, she examines questions of integration and law in relation to Romani communities. We at Tilburg University welcomed her already in the midst of 2008. And over the years, she has proven herself to be an excellent teacher. She was awarded Best Teacher and teaching qualifications, and I was told that her students adore her. Furthermore, she has been leading a prestigious NWO Wotro-funded project examining legal status as a structural barrier to participation, focusing on the Batwa of Rwanda. At present, Professor Goodwin is the program director of EDOLAT, the European Joint Doctorate Program in Law and Development, a cooperation between 6 European universities and funded by the European Union. This complicated enterprise she manages excellently, and her enthusiasm and dedication to the program are appreciated by all the participants. Professor Goodwin's education, ladies and gentlemen, carries a long history and it is very international. She holds a PhD from the European University Institute of the University of Florence, as well as an LLM with distinction in international law from the University of Nottingham. She obtained an honors degree in history from the University of Edinburgh, and before that she completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Tübingen in Germany. Finally, she worked for quite some time as a researcher at the European Roma Rights Center in Budapest. She has been a long-standing editor, I was told, of the internationally renowned German law journal, and is currently a series editor of the new Cambridge University Press series in global law. Over the years, Professor Goodwin has been using her excellent social skills to build up an extensive network in the Anglo-Saxon academic world, which is of great importance to our Tilburg Law School, as we intend here in Tilburg to accelerate our internationalization ambitions in the years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very proud to have Professor Morag Goodwin at our university, and I'm looking forward to listening to her speech, which carried the title, The Importance of Elsewhere. The floor is yours, Morag.
So I was going to start by making a joke, sort of riffing off the title and saying that I would rather be anywhere than here right now. But now that I'm standing here and I'm looking out at everyone and that you've made the effort to come here on a Friday afternoon in holiday week, I'm very glad to be here. And if I forget to say so at the end, thank you very much for being here today. Esteemed Rector Magnificus, dear Dean of the Law School, dear colleagues, dear students, family and friends, ladies and gentlemen. I've entitled this lecture, The Importance of Elsewhere. The words are, of course, borrowed from the poem of the same name by Philip Larkin. My claim today will be that the idea of the importance of elsewhere can help us make sense of global law, which, it should come as no surprise, is more or less the topic of my lecture today. What I want to do here today is to paint a picture of what I think global legal scholarship should be. My thinking about global law is heavily influenced by the history of the law and development movement. And although I won't have the time today to develop the connections between the two fields that I think are there, I think that there are lessons from law and development to be had for those of us interested in thinking about law in a global era. And of course, the postmodern brackets there in the subtitle suggest that I think that should be everyone who claims to be a legal scholar. And I'll come back briefly to this point at the end. I'm going to start actually by reading Larkin's poem. Larkin wrote it in 1955, 3 years after returning to Hull from his time working in the university library in Belfast. It's Philip Larkin looking very poet-like in his dressing gown. The importance of elsewhere. Lonely in Ireland, since it was not home. Strangeness made sense. The salt rebuff of speech, insisting so on difference, made me welcome. Once that was recognized, we were in touch. Their draughty streets end on to hills, the faint, archaic smell of dockland like a stable. The herring hawker's cry, dwindling, went to prove me separate, not unworkable. Living in England has no such excuse. These are my customs and establishments it would be much more serious to refuse. Here, no elsewhere underwrites my existence. Before I turn to analyzing the poem, the subtitle promised you a tale. So let me tell you a story of sorts. Before anyone gets too excited, I should warn you that it's a tale without a plot, and also one without an ending. And now that I come to think about it, it doesn't have much of a beginning either. But it's a tale told from the perspective of a community. Yet, although it's a tale of others, I remain, of course, the author. This is a tale set in Rwanda. If elsewhere is our relationship to strangeness, the Batwa in Rwanda constitute one of my current frontiers of strangeness. Since 2014, I've been running a research project in Rwanda together with Felix Nahinda and 2 organizations based in Kigali. The project is kindly funded by NVO Votro, and it investigates the counterintuitive hypothesis that the indigenous status of the Batwa community in Rwanda itself constitutes a barrier to their full participation in society. But rather than talk about the project or our provisional findings, I want to use my experiences in Rwanda as a basis for our thinking about global law. The reason for talking about my encounters with strangeness is twofold. I hope that for those who have no idea what global law might be, or why on earth it might matter for legal scholarship, that this example might illuminate it, if just a little. The second reason is that my experiences, interpreted through a law and development lens, can provide, I think, both a guide and a warning into how we should think about global law. The Batwa represent the 3rd largest community in Rwandan society, but constitute only around 1% of the population. They are historically associated with the Pygmy population of tropical Africa, who sustained livelihoods as hunter-gatherers. Today, most Batwa communities live in extremely precarious conditions. Pottery, a traditional occupation, is a marginal industry and cannot sustain the livelihoods of the entire community. And conservation efforts have removed the option of hunting. Instead, most members of this community now live a more or less sedentary life in small communities across the country, mostly on inhospitable and unproductive lands. As a consequence, members of the Batwa communities are generally the poorest and most vulnerable across the whole range of socioeconomic indicators. This is purely by way of background. None of this, however, matters to the story I wish to tell. So what do I see when I enter a Batwa settlement in Rwanda? This particular settlement is in Burera province in northern Rwanda. Well, the first thing to note, I think, is that what one calls this community already tells you a lot about the perspective of the speaker. Pygmies, and, well, you're something of an unreconstructed colonialist. Batwa, and you are likely to take their indigeneity as a given, as a natural status that is recognized but not constituted by the legal rights that such status denotes. Potters, and one identifies the community by their now largely former economic activity. And perhaps one also chooses to focus on their position on the socio-economic margins of society, as opposed to them being a political community. Yet tradition also plays a role in this designation as well. Pottery as an economic activity is a marker of difference. By continuing to use it as a reference, one emphasizes then the apart status of the community, even if only by reference to occupation. If one terms the community historically marginalized peoples, HMPs, the current preferred term of the Rwandan government, one highlights the marginalization and discrimination that has been a feature of inter-community relations, but places it in the past. They are historically marginalized. But it does not suggest that difference is immutable, only that they've been treated differently, badly, in the past. I should be clear at this point that I'm using the term Batwa throughout solely to avoid confusion, as it's the most commonly accepted term outside Africa, but I would ask you not to read anything more into it than that. So the second thing I see from the ground level of the settlement is the importance of the Rwandan state. Rwanda is a strong, centralized state, a point for which it receives a great deal of international criticism. The central government uses performance contracts with sector and district leaders to ensure that they deliver on policies set in Kigali. The Batwa are beneficiaries of national programs, such as the Gorinka program, which is the 1 cow per family. And our interviewees speak admiringly of Paul Kagame, and our findings provisionally suggest that Batwa communities feel Rwandan. They self-identify as such, and moreover, identifying as Rwandan appears to empower them. State sovereignty is thus front and center, and there can be no suggestion that the state is in retreat here. However, the state and its local authorities are not all one sees. If one scratches the surface, one quickly begins to see the imposition of the state structure and its borders upon alternative, older organizational frames. When we show up in settlements to conduct interviews, it frequently happens that our pre-selected interviewees are not present, and we are told by their relatives or neighbors that they've crossed the border into Uganda, Burundi, Congo, sometimes Tanzania, to visit family. Family structures form then this vast network of relations and obligations across the whole Great Lakes region. These networks pay no heed to state borders. Family is one reason why conflict spreads so easily across the region, as people, money, and weapons are mobilized to defend or assist relatives when they are threatened. The decision by the government in Burundi, for example, on 2nd of March this year, to require all foreigners to register is an attempt to mitigate the influence of family structures in relation to the renewed violence there. These large family networks play an equally important role in structuring everyday life and obligations, even where the state looms as large as it does in Rwanda. In addition to the state and to family as organizational structures, one doesn't need to be in Rwanda long to see the importance of religion in society. There is a small but thriving Muslim community in Kigali, but the overwhelming religion in rural areas is Christianity, and in particular, Roman Catholicism. In the lives of our interviewees, the Catholic Church is important not merely as a forum in which to express their faith, although it is, of course, also that, and for the local community that it provides, but as a wealthy transnational actor, the Catholic Church is able to provide schools and healthcare throughout the country. Our interviewees' children go to schools run by the church, and what healthcare they receive is frequently funded by the Catholic Church. Other transnational actors present on the ground include public actors, such as the European Union and its various agencies, the African Union, the UNDP, the UN Development Programme, and various national development agencies. There are transnational private civil society actors, such as Transparency International and Care International. A whole raft of environmental actors, both public, such as the UNEP, the UN Environmental Programme, and private conservation societies, concerned, for example, with the protection of the forests, and in particular the mountain gorillas made famous by Dian Fossey. The global market is also visibly present within any settlement. To get to Burera from Kigali, one heads north on a road built by Chinese investment, passing Chinese trucks carrying Chinese goods. The entry into the country of plastic products, a byproduct, of course, of the global oil industry, has rendered the traditional occupation of clay pot making unviable. The beer that is drunk in the settlements on special occasions, a Mutzig or a Primus, are now manufactured by Heineken in Kigali, and everyone older than 40 complains that they don't taste like they used to. I could go on at much greater length about the plurality of the actors and networks visible from within the settlement. I could talk about the global rule of law and how that impacts upon these seemingly isolated Patois communities. Or talk about the way in which global discourses on transitional justice have structured and framed the response to Rwanda's genocide. But I'm hoping that my point is more or less clear. While the majority of Patois live in isolated settlements on the margin of society, i.e., they are the very epitome of what it is to be local, they are at the same time intensely connected to and affected by global actors and global narratives about the environment, about the rule of law, about identity, about the market. What I hope is also a little clearer is the presence of a plurality of different normative orderings and the way in which they so readily transcend the boundaries of the state, while that state remains a strong force in the landscape. Further, I want to suggest not that these different organizational frames, the different narratives and the many actors, merely exist alongside one another, in parallel, so to speak, but rather that they interact in complex and dynamic ways. For example, in interrelations between the state and family network, or between the market, the family, the state, and the church. So much for the first tale. But now I have a second tale for you, also about the Patois, and this one concerns the question of race. In this second tale, I want to contextualize the Patois in terms of a global racial narrative. This narrative is both historical and contemporary, and highlights, I hope, the complex relationship between space and time in the construction of global narratives. In terms of the historical narrative, Rwanda's experience lays bare the brutality of the colonial construction of racial categories. The replacement of the pre-colonial, fluid social orderings by Belgian and German colonizers, together with the Catholic Church, was the product of colonial narratives of racial superiority. And these categories became a part of the post-independent construction of the Rwandan state. Even were we to discount the political machinations of the former colonial powers in the post-independent decades, the waves of violence that culminated in the Rwandan genocide cannot be understood outside of a broader global narrative of colonial racial politics. Similarly, the current criminalization of references to race and ethnicity within Rwanda must be seen within the colonial context and the consequences that flowed, of course, from it. However, in addition to the global historical narratives of race, there is also a contemporary global racial politics at play, one that is created and kept in play by multiple interactions between actors at the global, national, local, and inter-community levels. The Patois are recognized as an indigenous people by the United Nations. What is particularly interesting, however, about the indigenous status of the Patois is the active role of international NGOs based in the global north in pushing their identification as indigenous, and in doing so against the explicit wishes of the government in Kigali. The Copenhagen-based International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs took on much of the early work of gathering the necessary support for their recognition as indigenous, and another Scandinavian NGO, the Norwegian People's Aid, do much of the current work of financing Patois indigenous status. This is interesting in so many ways, at least I think so. As my colleague on the project, Felix Nehinder, has shown in his work, the concept of indigeneity has no history in Africa and makes little sense in such diverse societies. This different context is not considered by these humanitarian organizations who view indigenous status as always a good thing. Indigenous peoples, then, are the acceptable form of racial identity in a post-colonial global capitalist system. They're non-threatening because of their tiny size and the extent of their cultural difference. They become a curiosity, a cozy form of difference. Seen in this way, the application of indigenous rights to the Patois becomes an imposition of a form of legal knowledge developed in the context of the immigration societies of the US, Canada, and Australia, for example, and assumed then to be globally applicable. The point I wish to make with this second tale concerns questions of inclusion and exclusion. While the patois are indeed intensely globally connected, they do not participate in the creation and enforcement of these global normative orderings. This is not to say that they are passive recipients of these global narratives, but put differently, no one asked patois community members whether they wished to be labeled an indigenous people. And our provisional interview findings show that there's zero resonance on the ground for their own self-identity as indigenous. So thinking about global law matters not merely because we're observing a dramatic array of cross-border interconnections that affect how we think about law, but also because of the asymmetries of power and of participation. The two types of global normative ordering that I've just described with my tales, the expansion of what we think counts as law or normative orders, and the intensification of connections between them as the first type, and the application of a global narrative, in this case of indigenous rights in an African context, as the second type, are what many people think of when they think about global law. Several people have asked me, somewhat hopefully I thought, in the run-up to this lecture, whether I'm planning to define global law. Others have encouraged me to attempt an analytical account of global law. I'm not going to do this, not least because I think it's beyond my abilities, but also more profoundly because I think it is the wrong question. But I will say something about the confusion surrounding the term global law and attempt to address it. I think much of the confusion can be attributed to the difference between global law as an object of study or definition and global law as approach, as a way of thinking about law. In his monograph, Intimations of Global Law, Neil Walker takes stock of how the language of global law is actually used and uses it to provide a definition of global law that attempts to avoid the over-encompassing uses of the term to mean all law everywhere, and the narrowly reductive that sees global law limited to a false unity, a sort of level of law above international law. So think of Rafael Domingo's work, for example. Walker's definition of global law, then, is of global law as a practical endorsement of or commitment to the universal or otherwise general and warrant of some laws or dimensions of law. Translating that into slightly more accessible language, global law is the claim that some norm or form of normative ordering is or should be global. I find this definition really helpful. This definition allows us to distinguish global law from international law and from ideas about transnational law. While all global law then would necessarily be transnational, not all cross-border interactions claim to be global. Human rights, for example, may be laid down as positive law in international law, but they are also often the basis of global claims, for example, in relation to global constitutionalism. So while human rights form part of international law and are also frequently part of transnational law more broadly, they can also be global law. Similarly, while indigenous rights are part of and have their roots in international law, the work of an actor such as Norwegian People's Aid and the implicit claim motivating the coalition of actors that determined the classification of patois as indigenous sees indigenous rights better reclassified at that moment as global law. So Walker's definition is helpful in thinking about how we can distinguish global law from other legal categories. I would make one slight adjustment to the definition so as to include claims to globality that are implicit as well as explicit. I think to focus solely on explicit claims is to ignore much of how our world is structured. So global law as a form of law, or perhaps better said, a form of normative ordering, is what most people think of when they think of global law, assuming they think of global law at all. Studying the types of global claims being made is a valuable part of global legal scholarship. To be clear, though, We should study them because they are part of the legal landscape, because one cannot ignore them, not because we buy into them. But what I wish to suggest here is that this is not the limit of global law or global legal scholarship, or even the heart of it. Instead, I'm claiming that our focus should be on global law as approach, that it is this that is the heart of what global law should be. So let me use the remainder of this lecture then to outline an idea of global law as approach, and I will return to the idea of elsewhere to help me do so. Larkin's poem is a meditation on strangeness and acceptance, identity and difference, on customs and establishments. The obvious point to take from it is that there is always an elsewhere for law. It is trite to note that everything is connected, but in many ways it is. We know that we cannot study law in domestic isolation, that even local Dutch administrative rules need to be contextualized within the principles and structure of civil law, within EU law, within broader narratives such as global administrative law, in which a variety of actors play roles in setting and enforcing normative agendas. If we are interested in the role of a national ombudsman in anti-corruption at the municipal level within the Netherlands, we arguably ought to be aware of the origins of the contemporary anti-corruption function of the ombudsman as part of a grassroots movement that started in Rajasthan at the beginning of the 1990s, the Organization for the Power of Laborers and Farmers, a Marxist organization, and how that became mainstreamed as part of the global administrative law movement via the UNDP and the OECD in a very particular form, scrubbed clean of all its Marxist origins, that is now part of global good governance agendas. In understanding why we think about a particular problem, corruption, or an institution, an ombudsman, in a particular way, we need to understand its location in time and space. What does this mean for legal scholarship? William Twining claimed in his 2009 Montesquieu lecture at Tilburg Law School that we are all comparativists now. In order to move beyond the perspectival confines of our own legal system, in order to learn to see things differently, we need to study other systems and other ways of normative ordering. It is not enough, though, to limit our map to established legal systems. Levels of law. A global legal picture must be able to account for the complexity visible from a settlement like Barrera, for the mishmash of intersecting and dynamic forms of normative ordering. Doing global law as approach is to study the complex interactions between actors, normative frames, and processes, or, put differently, the who, the what, and the how. A global law approach pays attention to the crossings, the hybrids, the fluidity, the interactions, the irritations, and the incomprehensions that constitute the lived experience of the law. Moreover, a global legal approach is multi-directional. It doesn't only focus on the imposition of global narratives from above, but includes horizontal interactions and the complex dance between the many actors and levels, including bottom-up influence. The biggest impact of the work of legal scholars, for example, going out to Africa to reform legal education in the 1960s and 1970s, has actually been to the English law curriculum. It didn't do a great deal for universities in Africa, but it did a great deal for universities, law schools back in England and Wales. These scholars returned to the UK and used their experiences to revolutionize how law was taught. Of course, they pioneered the law in context movement. Global legal scholarship, thus, cannot simply be comparative law writ large. The work of comparative law may be a necessary beginning point, but it is not the whole story. In place of comparison, global law studies interactions in a context of traditions, but with a focus on fluidity. Such scholarship is thus a study of how law functions, the role or tasks that it performs, for whom, when, to what end, and in what circumstances. But we didn't really need Larkin's poem to tell us this. Larkin's central point is the importance of elsewhere in how we construct our identities, both over our lifetime and in a given moment. Larkin was conscious of his Englishness because he was in Belfast, just as I'm always aware of my foreignness here. But the poem raises a deeper issue than merely being conscious of the importance of the other in our identity construction. It is that our identity also conditions our encounter with the other. And this is as true for legal scholars as it is for librarian poets. Our attempt to engage with strangeness is nearly always an attempt to make the strange familiar, to render it in terms, language, and concepts that make sense to us. My encounter with the elsewhere of Rwanda and with the patois is my attempt to make sense of them through my own knowledge and with my own biases, as is theirs with me. The poem can thus be read as a warning about the encounter with elsewhere, a warning about rendering the strange familiar. The poem, too, warns of the danger of romanticizing the other. My customs and establishments, note for Larkin the mine is formal, compared to their streets, archaic smells and gruff speech. Of course, native Belfast residents had their own formal establishments and almost certainly didn't experience life in their city in the romantic way that Larkin did. Larkin's reflection on elsewhere leads me to reflect on the history of European encounters with strangeness more broadly. This history is largely one of imposing our own ways of thinking, our assumptions, our patterns of reasoning, our understandings of what counts as knowledge on the other. In 1528, the Spanish humanist Hernán Pérez de Oliva wrote of Columbus' second voyage to the Americas that he went, quote, to give to those strange lands the form of our own. To give to those strange lands the form of our own. This sense of innate superiority is not confined to the past, of course, and continues to condition much of our relationships with the rest of the world. The Third World approaches to international law school has shown not only how deeply implicated law was in the colonial endeavor, but how the nature of those encounters continues to frame and structure international law today. More particularly, one of the key lessons of law and development for global legal thinking must surely be the way in which the notion of development, of what it is to be developed, has been created as a mirror image of the global north. The notion of development requires that we see the developing world as lacking something that we, the developed world, have. Underdevelopment, or the concept of being developing, presumes a standard that developing countries are attempting to reach. The standard is, of course, the developed world, us. In order then to be considered developed, developing countries need to look like us, not just in terms of material well-being, but also crucially in terms of institutions, the ways of organizing government, of what the rule of law consists in, and so on. Our standards, our norms, our ways of life become the global standard against which all other societies and states are judged and, in general, found wanting. A further lesson to be drawn from the field of law and development is the response to the diagnosis of underdevelopment. The determination of the majority of the world's citizens as poor made them into objects of knowledge, our skills, our management techniques. Development then became an object of north to south technical management. And development demands our intervention. What does this mean for my account of global law as approach? How do we embrace the strangeness and resist the need to render it familiar? Firstly, we must acknowledge that we make choices. By describing my encounters in Rwanda as a tale, and by telling you two tales, I hope to draw your attention to the choices that I was making in framing the project. The framing of a particular study is always a choice. There are multiple ways of contextualizing the smorgasbord of actors, norms, and processes that I described. It is thus necessary that we acknowledge the choices that we make in adopting one approach over another, in focusing on certain interactions, actors, norms, or voices, instead of others. One of the key hallmarks of global legal scholarship must be an awareness that there are multiple ways of conceiving of or defining problems, issues, or topics, and that a normative choice underpins our determination that one way or another may be better in a given situation. What this means, of course, is that no description can offer the account, say, of contract law in a global age, or provide a definitive account of the patois in contemporary Rwanda. What this also means, of course, is that there can be no global law as object, that the claims to global law can never be realized. This is a point that I develop at much greater length in the written text. Secondly, then, we need to acknowledge and be open to the fact that these choices are conditioned by our own education and training, our own identity, both professional and otherwise. We cannot overcome this. We cannot leave the picture, but we can be aware of it. We need to remain conscious of our encounter with strangeness, even if, for example, like my skin color in the professorial cortege, it is the visible absence of the other that defines the encounter. I want to suggest that what is required of us as global legal researchers is that we are conscious of ourselves in our encounter with elsewhere. My greatest concern for the phenomenon of global law is that it is little more than a new phase in the colonial encounter, as we assume unconscious superiority of method or knowledge or technology. By viewing global law as an elsewhere, as an encounter with strangeness, by being aware of difference, of non-agreement, and of alternative epistemologies, I hope that we can lay bare the continuing role of law as a tool for rendering strange lands to the form of our own. It is at this point that Larkin, as man rather than as poet, reminds us of the issue that we cannot avoid when we take difference seriously. Larkin's letters show him to be a mean-spirited, misogynistic, racist little Englander, with, it has to be said, an addiction to illustrated magazines of the corporal punishment of hypersexualized schoolgirls. A genuine encounter with strangeness requires us to accept what may be intolerable, just as many of our customs are intolerable to others. This is an unavoidable part of taking strangeness seriously, and it is better to be open about our principles and prejudices, they are of course both, than to assume a superiority of both moral and method that we do not simply have. The final reflection that I wish to draw from the poem concerns how we deal with the fact of legal plurality and the lack of a shared normative safe ground. Larkin's poem is carefully constructed. Its emotions and impressions are neat and contained. The craftsmanship of the poet is obvious. Yet law, or legal norms, are more, of course, than the formal customs and establishments that Larkin claims as his own. They are also the herring hawker's cry and the smell of the dockland. In place of the poet's neatness, we as legal scholars are faced with a bewildering plurality. Law is necessarily emplaced in a complex world that is always beyond our control. And a global legal approach requires us to acknowledge that law, the legal interactions that we saw in Barrera, for example, are both beyond our full control and our full knowledge. This is, in part, a comment on the shifting patterns of interactions and the choices that we make in how we frame the object of our study. But it is also a way of saying that global law is necessarily interdisciplinary. Disciplines such as economics, history, anthropology, sociology, political philosophy, and geography have all made the study of law central to their own approaches to global governance questions. Global legal scholarship needs to engage with these disciplines, with their concepts, their analytical frames, and their approaches. The staggering plurality of what we now accept as law, the variety of the actors involved, and the dynamism of their configurations and networks entails that we need to rethink law and its functions for a global era. And legal scholars cannot carry out this task alone. At the same time, if law as a discipline is to have anything to contribute to the study of global law and governance, then interdisciplinarity within global legal scholarship must be reflexive, using interactions and exchanges with other disciplines to reflect back upon the place or role of the discipline of law in a global age. Instead, therefore, of striving to become poor sociologists, economists, or anthropologists, global legal scholarship should enrich our understanding of what it is to be part of the legal discipline. For example, are the properties that we assume are central to law, authority, validity, normativity, are these still appropriate questions in a global context? I think they probably are, but how do we ask these questions within a global legal approach? All of this suggests that beyond the need to contextualize law itself within social science and the humanities, what a poet's control freakery should also remind us of is the need for humility in our endeavors. I've been attempting to sketch an idea of global law as approach. Global law as an activity rather than a type or form of law. I hope this has made the idea of global law somewhat clearer, at least what I mean when I talk about global law. However, there are some in the room for whom this way of thinking about law will come as nothing new. I've had two types of responses to my efforts to develop global law as an approach. The first was from a colleague at Tilburg who quipped that what I was doing or describing wasn't really global legal scholarship, but rather good legal scholarship. Thank you, Philip Payman. The second is that what I'm suggesting is already out there, but labeled as transnational law, particularly, of course, in the wonderful work of Piers and Bunsen, who has done so much to develop the idea of transnational law as method. So what do we gain by using the language of global to describe thinking about law this way? I'm going to use my remaining minutes, which there's only a few minutes left, to suggest why I think the word global is important, why it is better for my purpose than transnational, and why we shouldn't simply drop both. In my tale of the Batois, I highlighted the importance of the state in the lives of the Batois community. But I also described the alternative ordering of the family that coexists with the ordering structure of the state. Both are incredibly important. One of the benefits of the term global, then, in contrast to transnational, is that it, in not putting the state front and center, expresses better the openness to alternative forms of ordering that is at the heart of this approach. Moreover, more importantly, global puts the spotlight on the normative. Cross-border interactions do not just happen. The types of interactions that I was describing in Barrera do not just happen. They are made to happen as part of a particular worldview. Global law, then, as approach, as I've outlined it here, is not a claim to planetary comprehensiveness. We do not need to study the whole globe. But rather, it's a challenge to think beyond Eurocentrism and the limitations of our own way of thinking. It is a demand to be global. In this way, the term global works to flag the choices that we as legal scholars make in defining our object of study, in the choices we make in highlighting or describing particular legal configurations and interactions. It tells us that there is nothing natural or normal about the assumptions and the choices that we make. And it is a reminder that our choices have consequences, precisely in making something seem like the natural or correct choice. As I tried to suggest at the outset, it is not a natural choice to decide to use the label Batois. Global denotes the elsewhere as something not requiring our intervention. Elsewhere is not the smell of Dockland to our formal customs and establishments. Disagreement or resistance to our assertion of a global narrative does not require that we educate the other. Rather, global demands engagement. The term global, then, is a reminder of the need for humility, of the need to ask questions and to take local knowledge seriously on its own terms, even where it is strange and confronting. Global means the importance of elsewhere, and it is a demand to take it seriously. It forces us to confront within ourselves the strangeness of elsewhere. And what this means, of course, is that global law starts with us. We're now moving into the end phase of this lecture, which is welcome news for those in need of a cigarette or of a drink, or both. And so too, the words of thanks. I wish to thank the Executive Board of Tilburg University and the Faculty Board of Tilburg Law School for granting me this chair. I hope to give you no cause to regret it. I had planned to say something in this lecture about what kind of professor I want to be. I think this is something we should talk an awful lot more about what we think a good professor is. But I was warned off by those who are probably wiser than I am. So let me just say this. I will endeavor to remain strange without becoming unworkable. I am lucky to work in a faculty in which young scholars with ideas are encouraged and are given the space to build their own ideas, their own castles, their own networks. Tilburg Law School is well known for this. I am particularly fortunate to have a number of supportive colleagues who have not only encouraged me and supported me and told me when I have done something well, but more importantly, I think, have cared enough to tell me where there is room for improvement. Rarely happens, but sometimes. I hope you will continue to do this. Thank you to Han, to Bert-Jaap, Randall, Hans, Rihanna, and Corrine, and of course, Matt and Miranda. At IPE, we're in an exciting phase of redefining our group and the research that we will do together in the coming years. I'm thrilled to be part of it. The Global Law at Tilburg project is an important part of my life here at Tilburg. But it is very much a team project, and I'm very fortunate with the colleagues that I have on the project. Randall, Pierre, Nick, Juan, very recently, and of course, Philip. Thank you. To my doctoral students, both past and present, Hannah, Tihitina, Vikash, Shwen, Lulu, Kiran, Himani, Mike, Asnikesh, and for a brief period, Carl, I am honored to be a part of your intellectual journeys. I've been very fortunate in my own intellectual journey and in the friends that I've made along the way. My formative intellectual period took place in Florence and was the result of wonderful encounters that are ongoing and that continue to form me. I'm speaking primarily here of my PhD supervisor, Neil Walker, of Piers and Bunsen, Ewan MacDonald, and Alexandra Kemmerer. My time at Maastricht was formative in another way. I moved to the Netherlands from Florence, uncertain about whether my future lay in academia. I thought I'd be rubbish at teaching. And in Maastricht, I was given not only the opportunity to learn from some of the best teachers that I've ever seen, but shown just how convivial an academic life can be. Thank you to Hildegard Schneider, Michael Farrer, and Peter van den Bosche for showing me just how it should be done. I have a number of other friends in the audience, especially Katja and Stefan, Ale and Giza, Vivian, Jochen, Miriam, and Ida. I know that I don't see any of you often enough, but it is your friendships that round out my life and make it so much the sweeter. Thank you for being here today. I've borrowed Larkin's poem as the frame for this lecture, but the importance of elsewhere has obvious personal connotations for someone who's chosen to live all but 1 year of her adult life outside the country of her birth. To my family, then, my parents, my brother Ian, my auntie Cindy, and my uncle Robert, you are the elsewhere that underwrites my existence. To my Dutch family, I very much regret that Jan and Emmy are not here today, but I know they would have taken pride in it. To Odette and Dick, but above all to Hannah, Jeroen, Eva, Jasper, and Isa, and now Joep and Guus, with the next family member only a few weeks away. Now seems a very good moment to say how much it means to me to be part of your family. And finally to Thomas, everything is made better by you. This lecture has put forward a claim that the idea of elsewhere is important in helping us forge a new type of scholarship that I've called global law. I hope that I've persuaded you, if only just a little. But away from academia, in an individual life, what is more important is luck. Only a fool believes that the little of what they've achieved is the result of merit or of hard work. It is mostly luck. I am so incredibly fortunate. Ik heb gezegd.
Thank you, Professor Goodwin, for taking our thoughts elsewhere. And thank you for being with us. We are very proud to have you at this university. Dames en heren, dat brengt ons thans aan het einde van deze plechtigheid. Ik wil u verzoeken het cortège zo dadelijk als eerste in de gelegenheid te stellen de zaal te verlaten. En ik wil graag afsluiten met gebed. En ik wil graag vragen dat u daartoe gaat staan. Leg gerust uw leven en al wat uw hart bezwaart in de handen van degene die hemel en aarde bewaart. Die wolken, lucht en winden leidt in de goede baan. En die zeker de weg zal vinden die uw voeten moeten gaan. Dank u wel voor uw aanwezigheid.